I started life as an avid reader, lost interest, or rather motivation, time, and energy as a young adult, and then spent much of my early adulthood having stints where I'd try to read, take too long to get through a book, feel like a failure, and then just kind of give up. COVID helped me out of a slump for a short while, but the second I went back to work, everything kind of fell apart again. Then, words became my life again, and I swore I would read more because how the heck am I gonna write if I never read? Well, reading during school was difficult, or rather reading things that weren't for school was difficult. But I decided to try something low stakes in my final semester. A reread of an old favorite. Hi, hello, welcome in. I'm Jerica, and I'm an editor, writer, and all-around content creator. And we're talking about reading slumps today. Originally, this was going to be about reading slumps and rereading, but it turns out I had a lot more to say about reading slumps than I thought, so rereading is gonna get its own video. I've hit a few reading slumps in my day, but I feel like I generally have a reason or a how I got out of the reading slump, especially for my most recent big one. And so I want to share a bit about that, as well as consider some other things about reading slumps, like what is a reading slump, why we fall into them, and how to get back out. So first, what is a reading slump? Simply put, a reading slump is any time you've lost the motivation or desire to read. I don't think there are any set rules about what constitutes a reading slump. Some might suggest that there has to be no reading for a specific amount of time before it becomes a true slump, but I'd like to posit the idea of levels of reading slump. For me, a minor reading slump doesn't even necessarily mean that you're not reading anymore. It's kind of like a red flag that something might need to change in your reading habits. For whatever reason, it feels like a slog to get through the book that you're reading, whether that's while you're reading, or you're struggling to pick up the book, or you've just finished a book and you're kind of struggling to choose what comes next, but you haven't really spent a whole lot of time not reading yet. A minor reading slump is very much a feeling than something that somebody else might see in your habits. If you are reading, I think an important distinction to make is that you're enjoying the book. It isn't because you don't like it and you should probably be DNFing it. You're invested in the story, there's just something else stopping you from continuing. You might also call a minor reading slump when the time between books is like less than a month. I had this happen during the summer while I was reading a couple of classics. I was enjoying them, but they weren't the vibe at the time. It was just too many serious and dense texts one after another. And I needed a little whimsy. We will come back to this in a bit when we're talking about how to get out of them and how I got out of that one. A reading slump TM, not minor, not major, just a reading slump, is when you stop reading for a bit, you don't really have a desire to pick up a book, and it goes on for, say, a month to 6 months. It's a pretty long time to be away from a hobby that you love, and the longer you're gone, the more negativity kind of builds up around the act of reading, and maybe some feelings of guilt for not reading, but you find your way back. A major reading slump is something else entirely. This is a wild beast. The way that I'm defining a major reading slump is, years of not reading or years of mostly not reading. Maybe you've read like an average of a book a year. Sometimes in little spurts, sometimes you spend a year on a book. This is the one that I really want to talk about today, because I did go through a reading slump, and we'll talk about how long it actually lasted based on where you want to draw lines, but it could be a very large number of years depending on how you want to slice it. Now, does it matter to actually define these different types of reading slumps? Overall, not really. A reading slump is a reading slump is a reading slump. But I do think that depending on the length and severity of a reading slump, you might be looking at different reasons why you've fallen into it and different ways of getting out of it just based on its nature. So why do we fall into reading slumps? Life? Brain? And that's really all it is. Obviously, those are very large and vague categories, but I think reading slumps are no different than any other hobby slump. It could be a lack of habit because your routine gets messed up. Life. Maybe hobbies don't look as good as they used to, maybe because you're a little depressed. Brain. Maybe you simply can't find the time, focus, or environment to read in. Life. Maybe the last book you read broke your heart and you can't bear to be hurt again. Brain. Not all of these are fixable with simple tips from a YouTube video, but I think we can learn to work with some of them and ideally get some help in others. In a lot of my writing advice videos, the first thing I ask people to do is to figure out the why of their struggle. You know, are you experiencing writer's block? Why haven't you started your story yet? Why are you struggling to set and or reach your goals? And it's the same thing for reading. Why haven't you been reading? Is it a lack of inspiration? You don't know what to read? A lack of time, energy, or focus? Your life's routine has changed with kids, a partner, a job. Is it a lack of interest? Maybe you need a different outlet or a little bit of mood rebalancing. Maybe you read an amazing book and haven't finished processing it yet. Or maybe you finished a book that was great until it wasn't, and you fear picking up another book that's going to betray you. Understanding what's stopping you from reading is definitely just the best way to figure out how to start reading again. I'd be curious to hear what's caused you to fall into a reading slump, or maybe why you're in one right now. And if you think it falls into this like life and brain, or if maybe there's something more specific that happens that doesn't quite feel the same as these other ideas. But now that we figured out why we might fall into a reading slump, let's figure out how to pull ourselves back out of one. This really is the big question of the video, is how to get out of a reading slump. And like all things, there's no easy or one-size-fits-all answer, but I'd like to suggest a couple of things. And I'm going to kind of frame them as the reason why and the fix for. So obviously I can't give you energy, time, or a quiet place to read, but I can throw some possibilities out there to help find these things. The first is the same advice I'd give for any hobby or really just anything you want to do, and that is to schedule time for it. When we put our hobbies on the calendar, it kind of helps give us permission to take that time for the hobby. It becomes part of the schedule, part of the routine, and we're less likely to fill that free time with doom scrolling or even things like cleaning the house, or other like productive things that like we should be doing and need to get done, but don't necessarily need to do right now. We can schedule time for those too. And I highly recommend, if you think this will add to your motivation, to kind of romanticize it a bit. Make it like a date with yourself. Create some sort of routine around reading, even. It might sound like you're taking it too seriously, but if you want to get back into reading, taking it seriously is kind of important. And taking our hobbies seriously, I think, is something that we should do more of. So consider choosing a favorite cozy beverage, grabbing a cozy blanket, having the right clothing to wear, lighting a candle, having a specific chair that you go to read. This, of course, only works if there aren't going to be distractions, and while we can't get rid of every distraction in our lives, we can put the phone away, and we can ask for help. So, putting the phone away is pretty obvious because a lot of us get distracted by our phone going off, needing to check if there's texts or new notifications. So maybe put that in a different room, maybe put it on Do Not Disturb, whatever will let you focus on reading. The asking for help thing is something that I feel maybe people don't think about nearly as much. And what I mean by asking for help is letting other people know that this is reading time. This could be letting your roommates know, please don't bother me, I'm reading and I'd like to have some uninterrupted time with myself. The same thing goes for a partner. And if you have, kids around, maybe asking somebody to babysit or asking your partner to take them to the park for an hour or something like that could be really helpful. Letting other people help you find that time can make it feel better that you're taking the time for yourself too. If you have animals that end up being a bit of a distraction like I do, you can even consider locking yourself away in a room from them. Obviously, locking yourself in a room away from your kids and partner may also be helpful, but at least they can also understand not coming and bugging you. Animals, a little less so. And I will say, if energy is part of this equation, if you happen to take a little nap instead of reading sometimes, I think that's okay. And finally, for this kind of time, energy, environment section, is if you really can't find time to sit down and read a physical book, you should really check out audiobooks. They're not my favorite thing mostly because I kind of have like a set of podcasts that I listen to, and so I don't want to take away from my podcast time by throwing in audiobooks. And I do just love having a physical book. I'm also not much of an e-reader person, although maybe that'll change. But if you can't do physical books because you always have something for your hands and your eyes to be doing, audiobooks while commuting or doing your chores, alongside your morning and evening routines. These are all great places to fit in that narrative you've been missing. And as part of each of these kind of ways to get out, I generally have a personal anecdote about them, and my personal example for this category is something that I've used many times to make sure that I get my reading in, and that is the scheduling reading time. And sometimes you can do this as like a daily routine, you can do it as a weekly routine. I have done both and currently actually have both going on. So most nights before bed, I'll read in bed for 20-ish minutes. I generally don't read very long. Anytime, actually, when I read, I don't read very long, and maybe that's something to discuss as well, is that you don't have to sit down for a long time to read. 20 minutes can be enough to start getting you out of your slump. But besides that, the other thing that I'm doing is every Sunday morning I sit down with my partner and we read while we're drinking coffee. And this was actually mostly his idea, because he had been struggling to read at night because he was too tired by the time we were going to bed, and he would drop the book on his face. And that wasn't a great way for him to be reading, and so he wanted to try to get some reading in on the weekends and figured the best way to do that was to schedule time in. And I said, heck it, I'll join you. Why wouldn't I have a cozy Sunday morning reading with a coffee? And to add, I do think that this routine is part of what saved me for the next example we'll talk about. But before we get to the example, we have to talk about the next solution. A lack of variety can lead to a lack of desire. And that happened to me this summer. And choosing something really different definitely helped pull me out of the slump that I could feel starting. So we could call this a minor reading slump, and choosing something different helped me get right back onto the I love reading horse. You can get crazy and try something super out of your comfort zone. This works best for people who are relatively narrow readers, like you really enjoy romance and so you read mostly romance, or you really enjoy horror so you read mostly horror. Doing something that is vastly different than that can be really helpful. However, if you're a wide reader, you tend to read like something of everything. Just picking something that's very different from your last read is probably the direction you want to go. And I think this is just about like a novel experience. If your slump is because you've read kind of like the same sort of story over and over again, you're just not getting the same thing out of the reading that you might be looking for right now. For me, this summer, I had been reading some pretty like big thinkers, namely The Unbearable Lightness of Being and Crime and Punishment. And it was probably halfway through Crime and Punishment, I was starting to feel the reading slump kind of coming on. I wasn't picking up the book as often. I was losing focus while reading a bit more. But importantly, I was really invested in the story still. It wasn't really the book. It was the type of reading that I was doing. Now, unfortunately, I didn't really catch on to this like strong enough, and the next book I read definitely pushed me further into the I'm gonna stop reading soon, and that was To the Lighthouse. It just didn't do it for me. Um, and so not only was it another kind of like classic literature, which is like same vibes, but it also just wasn't a narrative that did anything for me. And so I knew I really had to switch it up next. Otherwise, I was gonna start resenting reading. And that is definitely not what I wanted. Now, I could have gone further away because I stuck with classics, but I did do a genre classic. I read Dracula for the first time. And if you know the channel at all, you know that horror is kind of the the thing that I love most, probably, when we look at media overall. I don't know if it's my favorite book genre because I don't really know that I have a favorite book genre. That's kind of besides the point right now. But anyways, I switched it up from like these thinky classics that are kind of like philosophically based, like they're really about the ideas that the stories are about as much as it is about the narrative, to something that still had like the air of classics, I suppose. And there's definitely still some like very strong like philosophical themes, but it was a genre that I really wanted to read. And this definitely started to pull me out of that slump. I don't think that it was a strong enough jump in genre, but the next read I think really did it for me to bring me back to what I love about writing, or what I love about reading, and also writing and editing, because the next one that I read was The In Crowd, which is a YA horror kind of a la Goosebumps. And I don't know that I'd ever read a YA horror before, and if I have, I was super young and don't remember it at all. And reading this book kind of fulfilled a couple of things for me. One of them was just like experiencing something that like I hadn't really read before. It was horror, but it was for a very different audience, and so it was written very differently, and kind of had like different goals. And so both from a reader's standpoint and then like a writer-editor's standpoint, it was like a really fun read to go through, because like the story was fine. Um, like very tropey, but you kind of like expect it to be tropey when it's for a younger audience because they haven't read the tropes yet. They kind of need the base knowledge going forward to interact with more subversive stories, I suppose, because you don't really get as much out of a subversive story if you don't already know the tropes. Maybe that's a whole other video. um, but like examining how it was written was a huge part of the writing, so it was also like allowing me to kind of flex a different part of my writing mind, or my reading mind, if that makes sense. And that does feel like it really switched off the reading slump that was imminent. And I kind of continued down a slightly different path, kind of getting away from the classics that were on my shelves and moving into some thrillers, which was a lot of fun. Again, a genre that I really enjoy in other media and hadn't really read a whole lot of, so reading some thrillers was just a really fun experience. And again, like switching it up, getting my brain thinking in a different way while I was reading. Um, and I no longer am feeling that reading slump coming on, so it's something to be cognizant of and to be choosing your books, and also allowing yourself to rest, of course, is always fine, but um, making sure that you don't force yourself to read things that are going to make you hate reading. Because there's no should read which is maybe an important piece of information that wasn't in my script. On the other hand, from choosing something completely different, you could also consider an old favorite. Try rereading something. And that's what I did to really get out of my most recent major reading slump. And actually what inspired this video. Well, actually it inspired the rereading video, but the rereading video turned into a reading slump video, and now rereading is going to be its own video. But it was supposed to be this one. Anyways, this is kind of the like big case study of this video, so we'll talk about how the rereading is what really got me out of my reading slump, but then also some other things that maybe also were going on. So the first thing to consider when talking about this major reading slump I'm talking about is I don't really know when to consider it starting. Because there definitely have been a few moments where I've gotten back into reading again, but I feel like they never really sparked the hobby to last. I can almost make an argument for it starting back in like 2012. I definitely like read books since then, but not in any sort of consistent way. Except for maybe during COVID, so the other argument is that this one had been going on since 2020. Or 2021, I suppose. So it could be like over a decade, or it could be like 3 years. Either way, I think 3 years even is a long time to not be engaging in a hobby you supposedly love. There are a lot of things that kind of contributed to being in this reading slump, but I would say a lot of it was just mental health and the like grind set of life. At one point, I was reading Anna Karenina, and I think this might have taken me over a year. It might have been like over multiple years with like some time in between, and like I don't know that I got out of that book what I should have gotten out of it because it took me so long to read. I feel like I was really struggling to follow the story because of that. And so I tried a couple books after that. I picked up Tess d'Uberville and Huckleberry Finn, both of which I DNF'd. I did not enjoy either of them. So that definitely didn't help the reading slump. Picking books that ended up not being books that I enjoyed definitely didn't make me want to pick up more books. And then I read maybe 5 books during like 2020 to 2021. But the second that I got a job again, I just didn't have the energy to keep reading because I was just too dang tired. I'm sure there were other things contributing to the fact that I was struggling to pick up a book at that point. And I certainly wasn't making it a priority. In 2023, I went back to school in a writing course, and so narrative and reading and writing and editing all became like a huge part of my life again. I had some books that I had to read for school, but I don't really feel like they count as books read for school. However, because my schooling had summer breaks, I did decide that first summer to try reading again. And I read 2 books. And I made a mistake. Because those books I definitely enjoyed. However, I added something to the hobby that definitely I went a little too hard in. And this is a video that I'd like to do at some point, but I tried annotating them, and I think I just took it too seriously and tried to do what I thought I was supposed to do instead of like annotating that brought me joy, if that makes any sense. I think I was annotating for others instead of annotating for myself. And so that did not help. It put a lot of extra stress on reading because I couldn't just read. I had to have all of my annotating stuff there, and I had to be sticking in my notes and writing stuff down, and it was a mistake. So the next thing that started me reading even a little bit was I decided to do a buddy read in 2024. Loved this book. Did not really continue reading afterward, partially because I was in school and I had a lot to do for that. With my program, there were a lot of short stories, a lot of articles to read, doing peer editing and things like that. Especially come the final semester. Obviously, during schooling after that, I was still having to read short stories and articles and things like that, but I wasn't really doing any strictly pleasure reading. I think I picked up one nonfiction book that I read, except I think I read that over the Christmas holiday. So I just still wasn't doing it while I was in school. The second school picked back up, I was not reading for pleasure. Was I enjoying what I was reading? Sure, but that's different. I had at some point reread the first in the Chronicles of Amber series. Uh, and the reason that I had picked it up again was because I was creating a D&D campaign very loosely based on its premise. And so I had the intention of rereading the whole series, kind of as like studying or reference for creating that D&D campaign, but I only read the first book. So, at the kind of like the very end of 2024, beginning of 2025, I was like, I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna reread this, and it's a super low stakes read. I kind of already know what I'm getting into. I already know that I'm gonna like it, and it's not gonna be a difficult read. I know that there's not gonna be a lot of extra energy spent on trying to understand the book because in theory, I already know what happens. And I think this is a huge part of why I got back into writing. Obviously, not the only thing, because a lot of things kind of came together in the first half of 2025 that pushed me to be reading more often and reading for pleasure. Something that allowed me to be reading that while I was in school was simply the schedule of my classes and the fact that I had these very particular breaks that weren't quite long enough to go home or do anything else, but I could definitely go sit outside my next class and read for 20 minutes or so. There's that 20 minutes short reading times again that comes back as something that helps me continue reading. So what about this got me out of my reading slump? I think because it was an easy read that was relatively known to me already. I didn't remember everything because it had been over 20 years or something like, or it had been like almost 20 years since I'd read it. So, I mean, what I remembered while reading it, I was like, oh yeah, I remember this happening, you know, kind of like that, like post-read recollection of having read it before. And it didn't take a lot of energy to read the prose itself. Although there's some like really great lines in it, none of it is like hard to parse. Knowing that I would enjoy the story was a huge thing too, especially looking back at the few books that I read that I DNF'd like one after another, and that kind of like put me off of reading again. And I wasn't taking it too seriously like I did with the books the previous summer, where I wasn't trying to annotate this. I was doing a lot of analyzing already. There was a course during this time where I had to read like 7 to 10 short stories every week and give provide peer feedback. And so there was enough analyzing going on that I was like, I'm not analyzing whatever I'm reading now. I am just purely reading this for the entertainment of it. I think all of those things like really helped this be a huge piece of getting out of the reading slump. There is one other glaring thing that is pushing me to continue reading even when I start feeling that reading slump coming on, and that is this channel. I do feel some obligation to continue reading so that I can discuss my reads with you. This is not something that I'm giving as a piece of advice. I certainly do not think that everybody should be a content creator, but you can recreate this kind of obligation with a book club or a buddy read rather than trying to become a content creator. And a buddy read might have worked for me, but there are some extenuating circumstances around the buddy read that I did. And I suppose this is my final piece of advice, but it's a piece of advice that I provide with a lot of caution. Because I don't think feeling obligated to do a hobby is necessarily the healthiest way to go about things. And I think that feeling of obligation, the I should read rather than I want to read, can also cause a reading slump. So this is something where you really have to know yourself going into it if obligation is going to be helpful, and kind of find the right book club or buddy to read with that's supportive of you needing to take a break when you need to, or pushing deadlines for when things need to be read by. This is something that kind of holds me back from book clubs and buddy reads, is because I don't read particularly quickly. Um, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but I would hate to be the one who's holding other people back. And to continue on this, I know in the back of my mind that there will come a time where this obligation of reading things for the channel is going to start to get to me, and I will need to take a step back. Luckily, I am not just a reading channel, and I can focus more on writing and editing during those times. But it's something that I need to keep in mind so that I can save myself from myself. And it's part of the reason that I changed the way that I'm doing my TBRs from here on out. Which, we're getting off topic yet again, so I'm going to end on asking you to share your experiences. I would love to hear about the reading slumps you've fallen into and gotten out of. If you're in one right now, share your experience. Try some of the things that we've talked about and come back and let me know if they helped. And I'm curious if you find reading slumps to be something that are to be taken very seriously, or if you kind of just ride the waves of reading a lot and reading nothing, and if you just don't really care. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you guys had fun. I had a blast. Catch you next time. Bye. But I decided to, oh my gosh. And so I want to share that and consider some other things about writing slumps. What is a writing slump? Nope. Okay, our editing jerk is gonna have to do some stuff here. I'd be curious to hear what has caused you to fall into a oh my gosh. I'd be curious to hear about what's caused you to find